Oh, good morning. It's great to see everyone, and I want to say good morning to our friends in Gallup at Gallup Christian Church and those that are also listening online today. So it has been said that some of the most significant events in history have gone relatively unnoticed. In fact, Chuck Swindoll, in his book, Jesus, When God Became a Man, actually kind of chronicles this, and he lasers in on one particular year, and the year was 1809. He said in the year 1809, the world was enthralled and focused in on wars. In fact, specifically, the very fact that Napoleon was making his march across Europe. And so all of Europe and even the United States, people were on the edge of their seats wanting to know the latest about the wars. All the while, babies were being born. But no one could really think about babies because the focus was on wars. But in that year of 1809, Alfred Tennyson was born in Somersby Rectory. Oliver Wendell Holmes was born in Massachusetts. In Shrewsbury, a man by the name of Charles Darwin was born. And in Old Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln was taking his first breaths into this world. But no one was really concerned about the births that happened then. But the reality is the wars have stopped. But the ideas of Darwin and Lincoln, they still echo into today. And as well, the eloquence of Holmes and Tennyson still speak very loudly today. What seemed so significant then seems silent now, but the insignificant is still speaking to this very day. Consider 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the focus of the world was not on babies. The focus of the world was on Rome, on Augustus Caesar, and the census. No one had time to think about babies. They were all traveling to their place of origin. They were all saving money for taxes that had to be paid. But yet in that frantic busyness of all that happened during that time period, a baby was born. Divinity took on flesh. God became a man, and the one who was holding the world together was now being held. You see, what seems so significant then is silent now. But what went virtually unnoticed by most still speaks today in a very profound way. We're going to talk about that birth here this morning. And as we talk about that birth, one of the things I think it's important for us to understand is we can see the big picture. And so I want to take a big picture look at the birth of Jesus. And so by doing so, I want to go to the book of Galatians. Now, you probably never heard a Christmas sermon out of the book of Galatians before, but there is one little verse that if you're not careful, you're just going to read through this and not think a whole lot about it, but it speaks profoundly, not just about the birth of Christ, but the life of Christ. And even into the birth of the church and the expansion of the church. So if you have your Bibles today, we're going to be in Galatians chapter 4 for Christmas. And that's page 974. That's in the Bibles in the seats in front of you. But we're going to start with verse 4. And in verse 4, it says this, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." When the fullness of time had come. Literally, it points to the appointed time by God, but we're going to dig in a little bit deeper. Some have suggested when time filled up. When time filled up, it was the most opportune time for God to send his Son to be born into the world. So I want to ask the question, why was the fullness of time then? Why was the fullness of time then and only then and made every other time seem wrong? What was it about this particular time? I think there's some ways that we can kind of kind of look into history and we can kind of look into various aspects of things and kind of go, well, wow, that's kind of interesting. I think one of the realities that we could look at is there was a period of silence. There was what's called the intertestamental period, and there was the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, the birth of Jesus. It's about 400 years. And in that 400 years, there was this relative silence by God. And this relative silence, if you look at it, there was one miracle in 400 years. And that created something. One, it created despair. People were beginning to say, has God left us? Has God forgotten us? Has God gone AWOL? What's up with God during that 400 years? But I had a professor from Abilene Christian University who said that it was during this time that many were filled with expectation, that many were filled with anticipation of God has got to do something, and he's got to do something quickly. And so we begin to understand that there was this idea, even with silence, of great anticipation. There's also Mary and Joseph. And we could have a little bit of conjecture here, but we have to look at Mary and Joseph and say that they were from the line and the tribe of David and the tribe of Judah. And the reality is they were in the right family tree. I think it was more than that. I think it was more than just the fact that they were the right family tree. I think there was something in Mary and Joseph, and we're just going to have to figure that out when we get to heaven, that God said they're it. They're the right ones. But with that, one of the things about them being from the right family tree, they were from the wrong hometown. You see, the Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem, the town of David, but they lived in Nazareth, which is in Galilee, which is quite a ways away. And so God had to figure out how to get them from point A to point B. Well, there's a man who was ruling the Roman Empire at the time. His name was Caesar, Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar was, let's say, if you're an emperor, you're arrogant. And he wanted to see how powerful he was, but he also wanted to raise money in the process. So he said, let's have a census. And in the census, everybody has to go to their own hometown. They have to register, and they have to pay taxes there. And so he was thinking, I'm just making money in the process and being able to tell my friends how great I am. But God had other plans. He just figured out how to get Mary and Joseph from point A in Nazareth to Bethlehem in Judah so that Jesus could be born. God was beginning to fill up time. But I think it's even bigger than that. We have to even consider that with the fullness of time, or God filling up time, that it wasn't just about the birth of Jesus, it was also about the death of Jesus, and it was also about the birth and expansion of the church in the first 300 years. And what we know about that first 300 years of the church is that it expanded more rapidly than any other time in history. And so God was filling up time with that. There actually 300 years, at least 300 years, maybe 330 years before the birth of Jesus, there was this punk kid. We're going to call him a punk kid because he was 20. But he rose up the ranks of military, and he began to lead the military to where they were conquering the known world. His name was Alexander. And we probably learned about him in history as Alexander the Great. But over a period of 13 years, he had conquered pretty much all that needed to be conquered. And that played an important part of the fullness of time. We'll get to that here in a moment. But after Alexander, after the Greeks, were the Romans. They were the next great empire. And what God did through the Greeks and through the Romans is he set the perfect stage of the coming of his son, but not just the coming of his son, the death of his son, the resurrection, and the birth and expansion of the church. You see, there was a thing called Pax Romana. Anybody heard of Pax Romana before? Y'all are better than the last two services. I'm just going to tell you that. Pax Romana basically means the peace of Rome. I'm going to venture to say that if I were living in the Roman Empire at the time, it would not have felt like peace. It would have felt like occupation. It would have felt like the world was suppressing and oppressing me. But the reality is, during the Peace of Rome, there was a stable, somewhat stable government. So let's just ask this question this week. How many of y'all would just love a stable government? And that is a reality, right? Well, during this period of a stable government, and even a government of tyranny, there was also economic abundance. And with this, the most important aspect of the Peace of Rome was the Roman road system. Now, the Roman road system, there are still roads of the Roman road system that are still usable, and you can actually walk on them, drive on them, even still to this day. And we pave a road, and 5 years later, right? The Romans did it right. They had what they said 50,000 miles of road, and that 50,000 miles of road connected the epicenters. It connected the economic centers and the population centers all throughout the Roman Empire. But not just that. Not just that. One of the things that we begin to see is that there were 250,000 miles of smaller roads that connected smaller towns to those economic centers and to those roads. And what happened during this particular period of history is travel became easy. Now, easy for them, difficult for us, but for the first time in history, they said man could travel 50 miles in a day. Now, we do 50 miles in an hour or less, but 50 miles in a day. And so they created a courier system that was able to get basically information from one point to another very rapidly. Now, we think about rapidly, we can hit send on our phones and it can go across the world in a nanosecond. But the reality is this was amazing then. And so they did this for military power. They did this for commerce. But the reality is the Apostle Paul himself was said to have traveled 10,000 miles in his lifetime spreading the gospel. And not just that, they were able to take letters from one apostle to churches all throughout the Roman Empire. And so the Romans thought that they were building a road system that would allow for military travel rapidly, that communication would go rapidly, that it would create commerce. What they didn't know is God was creating a system of travel and a road system that would allow for the expansion of the gospel more than any other time in history. God was filling up time. But it wasn't just that. There was also, before the Romans, was Alexander. Alexander was a Greek. And so as he went from place to place to place and conquered the known world, one of the things that happened is people learned this language called Koine Greek. Now, Koine Greek is a dialect of Greek. Like all languages have dialects, a little bit different. But there was a thing called Classical Greek. And Classical Greek was the Greek of the hoity-toities, right? It's what the proper people spoke. In fact, they looked down on Koine Greek because that's what the uneducated people spoke. We speak the educated Greek. But Koine Greek was easy, and it was very learnable, and it was one of those things that it spread throughout the marketplace. So it became the marketplace language of the Roman Empire. And so while people may have spoke Latin at home or Aramaic at home or whatever it might be, when they were in bars and when they were in restaurants and when they were in factories and farms and doing business, they were speaking Koine Greek because everyone knew it. And with everyone knowing it, they actually, even before Jesus, they translated the Old Testament into Koine Greek because people could read it, and it was simple. And God, again, was filling up time. But when Paul and the other apostles decided that they needed to write from one church to another, they wrote in this language. And when they traveled from town to town to town, they were able to speak in this language. And when men decided that they wanted to share the story of Jesus, they wrote in this language because it was a language of the masses. In fact, some have suggested it was called Greek of the street. This was street lingo. It's how normal, everyday people communicated. And God used this time of a guy that just brought a language to the masses, and he says, no, now's the time. I'm going to fill it up. And I'm going to use this language to spread the gospel throughout the known world. There's also something else. When I think about this, everybody knew it. Everybody spoke it. It may not have been their native language, but they knew it. And I love the idea of this, is that God is for all people, because even in this small way, he made himself available to all people. That's something that I think we need to embrace today. God is for all people. Not for a certain group of people, but for all people. But with that, there's another reality that was playing out in the Roman world. If you look at the Roman world, one of the things that we begin to see is the Roman world was known for a lot of things. What it was known for is its power. What it was known for is all the roads. But there was another kind of dirty little secret, and that was anything went. It was an anything goes sort of society. And so what was happening is, according to James Boyce, who is a Bible commentator, he basically said that it was during this time that there was a downward spiral of depravity. And the downward spiral of depravity meant that people were willing to dabble into any kind of evil imaginable to men. And they were willing to commit any horrific atrocity known to man. And they were willing to try any religion that anybody proposed during that time. And what ended up happening is people were tired. They were weary during this time. You know, one of the reasons why they were weary and tired? Because they would try something because somebody said this is it and this is going to provide meaning to life, and it wasn't it. So they tried another thing, and they would try another thing, and they would try another thing, and they finally reached the point to say, is this it? And they were really open to hearing about this man by the name of Jesus. Now, I am not a prophet, and so please do not take this, what I'm about ready to say, as prophecy of forthtelling or anything like that. I just want to kind of connect a couple of dots. I think we live in a culture today of anything goes. I think we live in a culture today where people are willing to try anything. I think we live in a culture today where people are dabbling into every kind of evil and committing every kind of atrocity and dabbling in every kind of religion, hoping that something sticks. And folks, so what we're experiencing in our culture today is not new. It was true then, it's been true since then, and it is true now. But the reality is, and there are many who have written about this already, we may be facing a refugee crisis in the Western world. And the refugee crisis has nothing to do with immigrants. It has to do with refugees of the sexual revolution and drugs and alcohol and anything imaginable, where people said, let me try this. No, that's not it. Well, let me try this. That's not it. Let me try this. And there's that downward spiral, and eventually you're going to reach that point where people are willing to listen to a story about a man who was born in a barn and died on a cross but didn't stay dead. The people are going to be willing to listen because life doesn't work, and they're tired and they're weary. And Jesus becomes hope. You see, we're in the series that we're calling The Thrill of Hope. In the song, O Holy Night, we'll sing in a few moments. A thrill of hope. The weary world rejoices. Life wasn't working, yet there is hope. And when I read verse 4 of Galatians chapter 4, I find hope. But when the fullness of time had come, when time filled up, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Here's the hope. This is our bottom line here today. There is hope because God knows just when to show up in the fullness of time, at just the right time. God knows when to show up, but our hope is not just in the fact that God showed up. Because we read on and understand that there is hope beyond God just knowing when to show up. Let's look at verse 5. To redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. I can't unpack all of this, but I want to point out a couple of items here today. One is the word redeem, to redeem those under the law. To understand redemption is to understand debt. You see, there is a debt because of sin that we cannot repay God. And in our world, there are two extremes. One extreme is legalism. The other extreme is hedonism. And so people will live at those extremes, or they will live somewhere in between those extremes. But legalism understands the debt, understands that there's a debt that needs to be repaid, and they believe that through their goodness, through their good works, through their prayer, through their righteousness, that they will somehow pay for that debt. Impossible. On the other end of the spectrum is hedonism. Those who understand the debt, they just don't care. They just want to live and create more debt and and live life to the fullest, understanding that the end is death. I have a friend in the funeral business, and he said you would be surprised the number of times we do funerals where people ask for one particular song to be played because they know. And because they know, they celebrate, and that song is Highway to Hell. Imagine that being played at your funeral and celebrating and relishing that. But here's the reality, whether legalism or hedonism, they are different paths to the same destination of death, because there is a debt that cannot be repaid. But to redeem is to pay the debt. It's actually to balance the books. So it says that Jesus redeemed. He paid the debt. For the legalist and hedonist and everywhere in between, Jesus paid the debt. But that's not the end of the story. There's another word here, and that word is adoption. You see, with adoption, there is a beautiful picture. And we have an idea of adoption in our minds, but in the ancient world, it was different. If you went all throughout life and you never had an offspring or a child or whatever term you want to use, and there was no family member to receive your inheritance, what you would do is you would take a servant, again, no longer a slave. You would take a servant in your home and you would adopt them as your own late in life, as you're getting ready to die, so that you can have them as an heir. And so the reality is, Jesus doesn't just pay the debt, He invites us into the family. And by inviting us into the family, we receive the inheritance that Jesus so desperately wants to give us. You see, there is hope, and that God knows just when to show up, but there is also hope, and that God knows what to do when He gets here. He didn't leave us hanging, didn't just hang out and say, hey, I know it's tough on you. God knew exactly what to do. He knew exactly what we needed. Have you ever gotten that gift for Christmas that you didn't know that you wanted it until you got it? And then it's the best gift ever? Now, some of you are probably going to get a gift for Christmas that you didn't know you wanted, you still don't want it, and you want to figure out how to regift it next year, right? The reality is, Jesus knew exactly what gift to give us. You see, God didn't just send His Son to be born into the world. He sent His Son to die for the world. He sent His Son to die for you and for me. And we think about Christmas. Christmas is not a birth story. The beautiful aspect of Christmas is that it's an Easter story. It's a story of the cross. It's a story of resurrection. It's actually the story of Jesus reigning now into eternity, sitting at the right hand of the throne of God. This is hope. This is the thrill of hope. This is the best hope for a weary world. So the question, how do I own hope? How do I take this hope and apply it to my life in some way where it becomes really, really real? And one of the ways I'm going to say that we can own hope is trust that God isn't done. And trust that God isn't done with where you are right now. Because I think we can get into our past and we can get into our present and we get really down and say, where is God? In fact, I had a gentleman, he's actually in the room here today, and his name is Paul. He shared this many months ago with me, and it stuck with me. Your past does not dictate your future. Think about that. Sometimes we wallow in our past and we say how horrible life is, but here's the reality. What you've done in the past does not dictate what your future will be. But I think we also have to say, if the past doesn't dictate the future, neither does the present. Our present doesn't dictate the future. Where you are right now, what you're going through right now, doesn't dictate whether God's going to work or not. Several months ago, somebody gave me a book. It's called An Unhurried Life. Some of you probably need that book just about right now. But in the book, it basically says, Jesus was never in a hurry. You ever notice that? Jesus is never in a hurry. God is never in a hurry, but he's never late. He shows up at just the right time. So you might be wondering, is the job offer ever going to come? And what I'm going to say, God's not done. And you might be wondering today, is my marriage ever going to rebound? Because it certainly does not feel like it's on stable ground right now. And I have to say, God's not done. And you might be saying, is my child who was raised in church and made a commitment to Christ, are they ever going to come back? And maybe you have to say, God's not done. And maybe you're going to have to look at your past, look at the addictions, look at the abuse, look at the pain, look at the broken relationships, and you wonder, is God ever going to do anything about that? And we have to say, God's not done. We have to trust that his timing is perfect. And even in those times where we feel like God is silent and not working, maybe he's working behind the scenes. Maybe he's up to something big. We just don't know it yet. And maybe our marriage is going to be better than what we ever thought it could be. And maybe that child had to walk through the wilderness to get where they're going to be a great tool for God. And maybe the job that seems so elusive is going to be better than what you ever thought it could be. And maybe the addiction, the pain, the abuse, the broken relationships, God is going to redeem in a big, big way. I think we also have to trust that God can shape your life with the same perfection that he shaped history. When you look back on things, God did a pretty good job filling up time and coming at just the right time. And so we have to trust that maybe he can do that with us. In fact, I wrote this down. I want to say this just how I wrote it because I can't say it better than how I wrote it. If God can move in the mind of Caesar to have a census, and if he can use a conquest of a 20-year-old punk to give the world a simple language to the masses, if he can use a military strategy to create state-of-the-art travel, and with it create rapid communication, if God can stir in the womb of a virgin and squeeze himself into an infant's body, imagine what he can do with your life. Imagine what he can do with your life when you say, okay, God, you're the commanding officer. You're the CEO. You're the leader. You're the director. you're the Lord. Take my life. Do with my life what you need to do with my life to write a better story. Will you join me in prayer? Father in heaven, I thank you. I thank you for the perfection of your timing. That even though we can't always see it, and we may never see it this side of heaven, you're on your throne, and you're working your plan. So, Father, I pray that you work your plan in and through us in a way that we can't even grasp or imagine. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.